The neighborhood was the kind that most people dream about. The streets were clean, the houses looked well cared for, and every lawn seemed to compete with the next in its neatness. Birds chirped in the early morning, and the faint hum of sprinklers running filled the air. There was a sense of calm that made it hard to believe that tension could ever creep in. But as it often happens, appearances could be deceiving. In this quiet suburb, one woman had earned a reputation for being very serious about the rules. She walked through the streets with a sense of purpose, always keeping an eye on lawns, fences, and flower beds. Neighbors had learned to notice when she was out, because it often meant someone was about to get an earful about something minor. She had earned the nickname HOA Karen among a few residents, though no one dared to say it openly to her face. She saw herself as the protector of the neighborhood's beauty, and she believed strongly that everyone should follow the rules, no matter what. Across the street lived another resident, a man who preferred a quiet private life. He didn't mind a little disorder in his yard, and he liked to let his grass grow a little longer and the flowers bloom as they would naturally. His home was darker than most on the block, with shaded trees that made the front lawn feel hidden from view. He didn't get involved in neighborhood drama, and he avoided unnecessary conflicts. Most people didn't know much about him, but his calm demeanor kept him mostly to himself. He had a few friends who visited, but beyond that, he kept a low profile. The problem began one spring morning. Karen was taking her usual walk through the neighborhood when she spotted the man's lawn. To her eyes, it was an eyesore. The grass was uneven, and small weeds had found their way between the flowers. It wasn't dangerous or truly unkempt, but it wasn't perfect, and that was enough for her. She felt the need to act. Instead of going to the HOA board or sending a polite notice, she decided to handle it herself. At first, she walked around the edges of his lawn, inspecting it closely, muttering about what could be improved. The man was inside, unaware that someone was scrutinizing his property so closely. When he stepped outside to check the mail, he noticed her pacing across his lawn. He felt a mix of surprise and discomfort. He didn't know her well, but her presence felt invasive. He politely greeted her, hoping to diffuse the situation, but she barely acknowledged him and continued her careful examination. This became a pattern. Every morning, without fail, HOA Karen would appear on his lawn. She would pace back and forth, sometimes stopping to pick at a stray leaf or comment on a flower that was growing slightly crooked. The man tried to ignore it at first, thinking it would pass, but day after day it continued. He found himself planning his own schedule around when she might appear, avoiding the front yard whenever possible. Neighbors noticed the tension building. Some whispered about how strange it was for her to be so fixated on one lawn, while others quietly agreed with her, thinking perhaps he should have followed the rules. The street, usually peaceful, now carried a subtle edge. People would watch from windows, curious about how this conflict might unfold. Conversations at morning jogs and mailbox gatherings often turned to speculation about the man with the unkempt lawn and the woman who would not let it be. The man tried to address the issue politely. He approached HOA Karen one afternoon, standing at a safe distance on his driveway. "I understand your concern about my lawn," he said calmly, "but I like to let it grow naturally. I take care of it in my own way." She replied sharply, insisting that he was breaking the rules and that the appearance of his lawn reflected poorly on the neighborhood. He tried to reason with her, explaining that the grass and flowers were healthy and that he maintained them regularly, just not in the rigid way she preferred. Her response was dismissive. She told him that rules were rules and that no personal preference could override them. She continued to walk through his lawn, seemingly unconcerned with his presence or his explanations. Each encounter left him feeling frustrated and anxious. He wondered why she couldn't simply report her concerns to the HOA rather than taking matters into her own hands. Yet he knew that arguing further could only escalate the tension. Over time, the man began to notice the effect her visits had on him. The stress of seeing someone repeatedly cross his property without permission was wearing him down. His initial politeness started to waver, replaced by a cautious watchfulness. He began to consider ways to protect his privacy, while avoiding a direct confrontation that might lead to neighborhood drama or legal issues. The thought of taking extreme measures never crossed his mind initially, but he started researching boundaries and ways to secure his property discreetly. Meanwhile, HOA Karen seemed undeterred. Each day she appeared more confident and assertive, She carried herself as if she had the moral high ground, unaware that her actions were creating fear and discomfort. Other neighbors started noticing her obsession, and some wondered if she had personal vendettas rather than genuine concern for the neighborhood's standards. The man could feel the shift in dynamics. What was once a quiet, orderly community now had a strain of tension that lingered in the air. He reflected on the situation many evenings. Sitting on his porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, he thought about boundaries and respect. He had never had a serious confrontation with anyone before, and this was testing his patience. He realized that ignoring the issue was no longer an option, yet confronting her directly could make things worse. He needed a solution that would assert his right to privacy without causing a spectacle. It was a delicate balance, and he weighed every choice carefully. The tension also began to affect his daily life in subtle ways. He hesitated to open the windows, worried she might peer in. He avoided using the front yard for simple tasks like watering plants or trimming flowers. Even friends who came to visit noticed his cautious behavior and asked questions he was reluctant to answer. The presence of someone constantly monitoring his property changed how he experienced his own home, and he felt an increasing need to reclaim his space. Despite the growing stress, he continued to approach the situation thoughtfully. He researched neighborhood rules, HOA guidelines, and even spoke quietly to neighbors he trusted to gather advice without creating gossip. He wanted to act within reason, without escalating the conflict further. His goal was simple: to protect his privacy and maintain his way of life, without causing harm or confrontation that could have long-lasting effects on his reputation. In the quiet moments, he reflected on HOA Karen herself. She was a figure of authority in her own mind, believing she was maintaining order and beauty. Yet from his perspective, she was overstepping, disregarding personal boundaries and creating unnecessary stress. He wondered if she realized the impact of her actions on the people around her, or if she was so focused on rules that she lost sight of common courtesy. The stage was set for what was to come. Both individuals had their perspectives firmly in place, and the neighborhood watched silently. What started as a minor concern about the appearance of a lawn had grown into a tense standoff. Each day added another layer to the story, increasing suspense and the potential for an unexpected twist. The quiet suburb, with its manicured lawns and gentle morning breezes, was no longer as peaceful as it seemed, and the man could feel that change deep in his bones. He knew that something would have to give. Whether it would be through dialogue, compromise, or another method entirely, he could not continue to endure the daily invasions of his privacy without taking action. But the question lingered: how could he respond effectively without escalating the situation into something dangerous or damaging? He needed a plan, and every option had to be considered carefully. And so the days passed with HOA Karen walking back and forth across his lawn, inspecting, judging, and asserting her version of order. The man watched, thought, and planned. The neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see which way the tension would tip. It was a delicate human drama unfolding in a seemingly ordinary street, a story of boundaries, privacy, and the subtle ways that one person's actions could ripple through the lives of others. In this quiet suburb, the calm had shifted, and something significant was quietly building beneath the surface. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. HOA Karen showed up every morning like clockwork, walking across the man's lawn as if it were her duty to patrol the neighborhood personally. Her steps were measured and deliberate, and she often paused to inspect the grass, the flowers, and even the small stones along the walkway. Each time she crossed, the man watched from inside, trying to maintain calm and patience. But the tension was becoming harder to manage. Every visit felt like a small invasion of his space, and he could feel his frustration building slowly, like a storm just beneath the surface. The man had tried to keep a friendly attitude, greeting her politely whenever she glanced his way. He would smile, nod, and sometimes say something simple like, "Good morning, B." But she rarely responded in kind. Most of the time, she barely acknowledged him, lost in her mission to monitor the lawn. Her eyes would dart from one patch of grass to another, her brow furrowed as she muttered about weeds or uneven growth. It became clear that reasoning with her would not be simple. She seemed determined, almost single-minded, to ensure that the lawn met her exact standards. At first, the man tried small, polite attempts to dissuade her, He explained how he preferred to let his yard grow naturally, and assured her that he was taking care of it in his own way. He showed her small improvements he had made, new flowers planted, the grass trimmed in certain areas, and the edges carefully tended. She nodded, but then immediately found something else to comment on. Her focus was relentless. Each morning felt like a test of patience, and the man began to dread the start of the day. Neighbors started noticing the strange interactions. Some would watch quietly from their windows, fascinated by the unusual scene. A few brave ones tried to offer advice, suggesting that he take the issue to the HOA board formally, or even report the repeated trespassing. But he hesitated. He didn't want the situation to escalate unnecessarily. Legal confrontations, fines, or public arguments were not something he wanted to involve himself in. Yet he felt cornered. His privacy was being intruded upon daily, and the sense of being watched was exhausting. One afternoon, he stepped outside to water his plants. He tried to engage casually, greeting HOA Karen with a calm, friendly tone. "I'm just watering my flowers this morning," he said, hoping a simple acknowledgement of his activity might shift her perspective. She didn't respond verbally. Instead, she walked past him, eyes focused on the grass, her hands clasped behind her back. He felt a surge of irritation, but he swallowed it. Any reaction he showed might feed into her sense of authority over his property. He knew he needed a more strategic approach. The man began to notice patterns in her behavior. She always came around the same time each morning, usually right after the neighborhood coffee truck left. She would spend exactly 15 to 20 minutes walking the same path across his lawn, pausing occasionally to point at something she considered imperfect. It became predictable, which allowed him to plan his own activities around her visits. Still, even with preparation, her presence created a strain that he couldn't ignore. He also started paying attention to small signs of her intrusion: footprints in the soil where he had recently planted seeds, slight indentations on the grass, and the way the flowers had been slightly disturbed all indicated that her visits were leaving a lasting impact. While she might have believed she was simply inspecting, the effects of her steps were physical proof of her invasions. It was a subtle but constant reminder that his private space was not truly his anymore. The man began thinking about the larger consequences. What if she continued unchecked? What if other residents began to see her actions as acceptable and started following her example? The idea of his lawn being a public thoroughfare filled him with unease. He wanted to protect his home, his privacy, and his sense of peace without creating a spectacle or conflict that would ripple through the entire neighborhood. He needed a plan, one that would assert boundaries effectively and without confrontation. As he pondered solutions, the man also reflected on HOA Karen's perspective. She truly believed she was helping, maintaining order and preserving the beauty of the neighborhood. To her, the lawn was a symbol of rules being followed or ignored. He understood that her actions were driven by a strong sense of duty, but they were also misplaced. Her persistence, while well-intentioned in her own mind, was creating stress and tension. Recognizing her motivations did not make the intrusions any easier to tolerate, but it helped him frame the situation in a less hostile light. Over the next few days, he tried different tactics. He planted flowers strategically along the edges of the lawn, hoping that a visual barrier might deter her from walking directly across. He trimmed certain areas to create neat patches that might satisfy her eyes, while still allowing the lawn to maintain its natural growth. He experimented with signs, small and unobtrusive, politely asking for respect for his private property. Each attempt met with limited success. Karen noticed the changes, often approving briefly but then quickly moving on to another point of concern. Her focus was unrelenting, and he realized that minor adjustments would not stop her. The strain began to affect his daily routines. He avoided opening windows, walking outside for leisure, or using the driveway when he knew she might be out. Simple acts that had once brought him joy now carried anxiety. Friends visiting for coffee or conversation noticed the tension in his behavior and asked what was wrong. He tried to downplay it, explaining only that he had a persistent neighbor who was very focused on the lawn. They offered support, but he could tell that some thought he was overreacting. Yet he knew the reality. His privacy was being violated regularly, and the emotional toll was real. The man also noticed subtle shifts in HOA Karen's demeanor. She seemed more confident, perhaps even a little smug, with her morning inspections. There was a sense of triumph in her posture, as if each walk across the lawn was a small victory. He recognized the danger in this perception. If she felt empowered by his inaction, her behavior might escalate. He realized he needed a response that would protect his space while also signaling boundaries clearly. It could not be aggressive, but it had to be firm. Even with careful planning, the tension continued to build. Each day felt like a test of patience, and he found himself constantly thinking about the next encounter. He reviewed options in his mind, politely speaking to her again, involving the HOA, or taking discreet protective measures around the lawn. Each option had risks, and he weighed them carefully. Escalation could make the situation public and stressful, but inaction meant ongoing intrusion. He needed a creative solution that balanced caution with assertiveness. Neighbors were quietly observing, forming opinions but rarely intervening. Some admired his patience, while others were amused by the persistent presence of HOA Karen. The street had become a subtle theater, with the lawn as the stage and the two residents as the central actors. Each morning, passers-by might see the scene unfold without understanding the full story. The man became acutely aware of the social dynamics, realizing that any action could influence not just his own experience, but also the way others perceived both him and HOA Karen. He continued to plan silently. Walking through the house, looking at the lawn and observing her pattern gave him a sense of control. While the intrusion was frustrating, it also forced him to think strategically, to consider long-term solutions, and to anticipate reactions. He reflected on human behavior, on the importance of boundaries, and on how strongly people can feel about perceived rules and order. Each day added to his understanding, even as it increased the tension. The story of the lawn and the persistent neighbor was far from over. The man knew that he could not allow the daily intrusions to continue indefinitely. He needed a solution that respected his privacy, maintained his dignity, and avoided unnecessary conflict. As he watched HOA Karen pacing across the grass yet again, he made a silent decision. He would find a way to protect his space, and he would do it carefully. He was determined to reclaim his sense of calm and peace, even if it required measures that were unusual or creative. As the sun dipped lower each evening, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, he sat on his porch reflecting on the events of the day. The quiet hum of suburban life continued around him, but the tension in his own yard lingered. He realized that the conflict was not just about grass or flowers. It was about respect, boundaries, and personal space. And he understood that the next steps he took would shape the neighborhood's balance for the foreseeable future. The stakes were higher than they appeared, and the story of the lawn, HOA Karen, and the man determined to protect his privacy was just beginning to take its next turn. The man spent many days thinking about the best way to handle the situation. He did not want to escalate it into a full conflict. He did not want legal trouble, gossip, or arguments with neighbors. But he also knew he could not continue to allow daily intrusions on his property. Each morning, when he saw HOA Karen pacing across his lawn, he felt a sense of violation and stress that weighed heavily on him. It became clear that he needed a solution, and it needed to be effective without causing harm. He began researching ways to secure his property without confronting her directly. He looked into fences, small signs, and even motion sensors. But he wanted something that was discreet and immediate. The idea of erecting a large fence or a gate seemed too aggressive and would draw attention, potentially escalating the situation. Signs asking her to stop might be ignored or dismissed. He realized that if he wanted to reclaim his privacy, he needed a method that would create a clear boundary while keeping things subtle. One evening, after hours of reading and considering options, he devised a plan. It was not meant to harm anyone physically, but to send a clear message that the lawn was private, and that further intrusion would not be tolerated. He began preparing his yard quietly, placing small hidden deterrents under the grass in strategic areas where HOA Karen typically walked. These were subtle, and would create a noticeable sensation when stepped on, enough to make her reconsider walking freely across his property. He double-checked that nothing could cause serious injury, focusing solely on discouraging trespassing. The man worked carefully, ensuring the devices were secure and hidden from view. He spent hours testing areas of the lawn, walking over the spots himself to ensure they were effective but not dangerous. He wanted to maintain control, not create an accident that could involve law enforcement or neighbors. The planning required patience and attention to detail, and he approached it with the calm determination that had characterized him from the beginning. Once everything was in place, he observed from his window the next morning, anxious to see the results. HOA Karen arrived as usual, with her determined pace and focused gaze. She began walking across the lawn, inspecting the grass as she always did. When she stepped on the prepared areas, she noticed immediately that something was unusual. The sensation under her feet caused her to pause and examine the ground more closely. At first she seemed confused, unsure what had changed. Then she realized that the lawn was no longer easy to walk across as before. Her behavior shifted subtly. Instead of continuing her regular patrol, she began to hesitate, stepping carefully and reconsidering each move. The man watched from inside, relieved that the deterrents were working as intended. She did not notice him observing her, but her movements became cautious and uncertain. The repeated walks that had caused so much stress now slowed, with her attention shifting from inspecting the lawn to trying to navigate the unusual surface. The effect on HOA Karen's confidence was noticeable. She was used to walking freely, asserting her perspective without challenge. Now faced with an unexpected obstacle she had to adjust, she slowed her pace, testing small areas and even stepped back to consider alternative paths across the lawn. The man could see the shift in her behavior and felt a sense of relief, knowing that his quiet measures were successful in asserting his boundaries. Over the next few days, the routine changed. HOA Karen continued to appear, but her steps were cautious, hesitant, and deliberate. She no longer marched across the lawn with the same certainty. The man noticed a gradual reduction in the number of visits, and when she did come, she spent less time inspecting the lawn. It was clear that his strategy was working, subtly communicating that the lawn was private and that trespassing would no longer be effortless. Neighbors began to notice the change as well. Some wondered if HOA Karen had lost interest, or if she had finally accepted that the man's lawn would not conform entirely to her expectations. Others speculated silently about the shift in behavior, curious about what had caused the change. The man did not share his approach with anyone, keeping his strategy private, understanding that transparency could undermine the effectiveness of the measures. He preferred to observe quietly and ensure that his home remained his sanctuary. While the immediate stress of daily intrusions decreased, the man remained cautious. He understood that HOA Karen might test the boundaries again, so he continued to monitor the lawn, ensuring that the deterrents remained effective. He did not relish the need for such measures, but he recognized that asserting boundaries was essential for his peace of mind. Each day he observed the neighborhood, balancing vigilance with a desire to maintain calm and normalcy. This period of adjustment also allowed him to reflect on human behavior. He considered how strongly people could insist on their perspective, how rules could become an obsession, and how subtle measures could achieve resolution without direct confrontation. He realized that patience, careful planning, and nonviolent deterrence could create change effectively, even in situations that seemed frustrating or persistent. The man's relationship with his own space shifted as well. He felt a renewed sense of control and security, knowing that he had taken steps to protect his privacy. Simple acts like opening windows, walking across the lawn, or spending time outdoors no longer carried the anxiety they once did. The lawn became a symbol of personal boundaries and careful planning, a reminder that he could assert his needs without conflict escalating unnecessarily. HOA Karen, on her part, adjusted slowly. She continued her inspections occasionally, but with caution and less frequency. Her confident demeanor was tempered by the new experience, and she began to reconsider the way she approached the neighborhood. It was not a complete change, but it was enough to restore a sense of balance to the street. The tension that had been palpable began to fade, replaced by a cautious respect for boundaries, even if unspoken. During this time, the man also noticed a subtle shift in his neighbors' attitudes. Some expressed relief that the situation seemed less intense, while others quietly admired his ability to handle the challenge without confrontation. The neighborhood, which had been on edge, began to regain its sense of calm. The story of the persistent neighbor and the determined resident remained a quiet topic, but it no longer carried the same tension or anxiety. Life on the street returned to a more peaceful rhythm. Reflecting on the experience, the man understood important lessons about privacy, boundaries, and human behavior. He realized that persistence without consideration could cause unintended stress and conflict, while careful planning and thoughtful action could create resolution without escalation. He appreciated the value of discretion, patience, and subtle influence, recognizing that not all problems needed to be addressed through confrontation or aggressive measures. The man also found a renewed sense of confidence in his ability to manage his environment. He knew that challenges could arise and that people might test limits, but he had proven to himself that he could respond effectively while maintaining calm and dignity. The lawn, once a source of stress, had become a place of empowerment, a testament to careful thought and strategic action. In the quiet moments, he would sit on his porch and watch the sun rise and set over the neighborhood, appreciating the peace that had returned. HOA Karen still walked occasionally, but her presence no longer carried the same weight. He had restored balance not through confrontation or anger, but through thoughtful and deliberate measures that respected both his needs and the boundaries of safety. The man understood that life in the neighborhood would always have its challenges, and that people would have differing views and priorities. But he also knew that he could navigate these situations with patience, creativity, and a commitment to maintaining his own peace. The experience with HOA Karen had taught him valuable lessons about resilience, strategy, and the importance of asserting boundaries without unnecessary conflict. As the weeks passed, the man felt a renewed sense of calm and control. His lawn remained his sanctuary, and his daily routines no longer carried the anxiety that had once been so heavy. He continued to observe the neighborhood quietly, aware of patterns, anticipating potential challenges, and ready to respond with care and thoughtfulness. The tension that had once defined his days was now replaced with a sense of order, balance, and quiet satisfaction. The story of the lawn and the determined neighbor had reached a turning point, and the man had successfully navigated the challenge with intelligence, patience, and a careful plan that maintained peace for himself and the neighborhood. After the initial success of his plan, the man began to notice changes in HOA Karen's behavior. She no longer walked across his lawn with the same confidence and authority. Her steps were hesitant, her eyes scanning the ground carefully as if expecting the unexpected. Each morning he observed from a distance, curious about her reactions and relieved that his private space was finally respected. The tension that had dominated his mornings had started to diminish, and he felt a renewed sense of control over his life and property. HOA Karen tried to adapt, at least on the surface. She would still appear on the street, but her visits were shorter, less frequent, and her inspections were hurried. She seemed to be testing the boundaries without fully understanding them. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of the lawn, looking for signs of what had changed, and then walk away with a furrowed brow. The man watched quietly, taking comfort in the fact that she was beginning to reconsider her actions. Her confidence had been shaken, and the aura of control she once carried had diminished. Neighbors also began to notice the shift. Some commented quietly to each other about the change in her routine, speculating that she had perhaps grown tired or realized that her actions were not producing the results she wanted. Others noticed that the man was spending more time outside again, walking across his lawn, tending to his flowers, and enjoying the small freedoms he had once taken for granted. The subtle drama of the street had begun to settle, and a sense of calm returned to the neighborhood. Despite the progress, the man remained cautious. He knew that HOA Karen could attempt to test the boundaries again, and he stayed alert, observing her movements from his windows or porch. He continued to ensure that the deterrents on his lawn were effective, without being dangerous or harmful. He understood that maintaining the balance required ongoing attention and careful consideration. The goal was not to punish but to protect, and he approached it with patience and care. Over time, he also reflected on the human side of the situation. He recognized that HOA Karen's behavior was driven by a desire for order and control, a need to see rules followed. From her perspective, she was maintaining standards and doing her part to keep the neighborhood beautiful. Understanding her motivations helped him frame the situation without anger or resentment. While her actions had caused stress, they were not malicious, they were misguided, and that distinction allowed him to feel empathy even while maintaining firm boundaries. The man also considered the impact of the situation on the broader neighborhood. He realized that conflicts often escalate when people act without thinking about consequences or the perspectives of others. By taking a thoughtful, measured approach, he had avoided public arguments, fines, or legal complications. The story of his lawn and HOA Karen remained a quiet lesson in discretion, patience, and the importance of respecting personal space. The neighborhood continued to function smoothly, with only subtle signs of the earlier tension. As weeks passed, the man noticed that HOA Karen's visits became even more sporadic. She would sometimes drive slowly down the street, glance at the lawn from her car, and then move on. Other times she would walk along the sidewalk, talking to neighbors or tending to her own property, avoiding the area where she had once insisted on walking. It was a sign that the subtle message had been received. The man's careful planning and thoughtful measures had established a boundary without confrontation, and HOA Karen was learning, in her own way, to respect it. The man felt a sense of accomplishment, not from a place of pride or triumph, but from the knowledge that he had successfully managed a difficult situation while maintaining his values. He had protected his privacy, asserted his boundaries, and avoided unnecessary conflict. The experience had taught him about patience, strategy, and the importance of understanding human behavior. He had learned that sometimes, quiet actions and subtle measures can achieve more than confrontation or aggression. He also noticed that life in the neighborhood began to return to a more peaceful rhythm. Children played on the lawns without hesitation. Neighbors chatted over fences, and the gentle hum of daily life returned. The street regained its calm, and the earlier tension became a quiet story that lingered in the background, mostly forgotten by all but the man and HOA Karen. Their interactions were no longer a daily source of stress, and he could enjoy his home and yard as he had always wanted. While the conflict had been resolved in a subtle way, the man remained thoughtful about the potential for future challenges. He understood that people's behavior could change unpredictably, and that vigilance without paranoia was necessary to maintain personal boundaries. He continued to observe the neighborhood, keeping an eye on patterns and preparing quietly for any potential intrusion, knowing that foresight and careful planning were essential for maintaining peace. HOA Karen herself seemed to have learned, at least partially, from the experience. She was more cautious in her interactions with neighbors and more thoughtful about the impact of her actions. While she still cared about rules and order, she had adjusted her approach, perhaps realizing that persistence without consideration could lead to unintended consequences. The subtle shift in her behavior was a quiet victory for the man, reinforcing the value of patience and strategic thinking. During this time, the man also began to reflect on broader lessons about community and coexistence. He recognized that neighborhoods function best when individuals respect each other's space and autonomy. Conflicts often arise when personal boundaries are ignored or underestimated. By addressing the situation thoughtfully, he had preserved not only his own peace but also the overall harmony of the neighborhood. His experience became an example of how careful action, empathy, and strategic planning can resolve disputes without escalation. The man also found personal growth through the experience. He had faced daily stress and pressure without losing his composure. He had learned to think critically, observe patterns, and implement solutions that were effective and safe. The situation with HOA Karen had been a test of patience, creativity, and resilience, and he had emerged with a deeper understanding of human behavior and the importance of boundaries. As the days turned into weeks, he continued his routines with a renewed sense of confidence. Walking across his lawn, tending to his flowers, and spending time outdoors no longer carried anxiety. He enjoyed the small pleasures of his home and neighborhood once more, appreciating the peace and calm that he had worked to restore. The quiet satisfaction of a problem resolved through thoughtful action brought a sense of contentment that he had not experienced during the height of the tension. HOA Karen's influence on the street gradually diminished. She remained a presence in the neighborhood, but her role as a self-appointed enforcer of rules was less pronounced. The other neighbors continued with their daily lives, observing the subtle dynamics without becoming involved. The man's careful handling of the situation had restored balance, and the quiet tension that had once defined the street was now replaced with calm and normalcy. Reflecting on the entire experience, the man understood that the situation had been more than just a conflict over a lawn. It had been a lesson in human behavior, boundaries, and strategic thinking. He had learned the value of patience, empathy, and subtle influence. He realized that many conflicts could be managed effectively through thoughtful planning and careful action, rather than confrontation or aggression. The experience had strengthened his confidence and provided insights that would serve him well in future interactions. The man also appreciated the importance of maintaining perspective. He recognized that while HOA Karen's actions had caused stress, they were driven by her perception of duty and order. Understanding her motivations helped him navigate the situation without resentment or anger. By balancing empathy with firm boundaries, he had achieved a resolution that protected his privacy while preserving the overall harmony of the neighborhood. As the sun set on the quiet street, casting long shadows across the lawns, the man felt a deep sense of relief. The daily intrusions had ended, the neighborhood was calm, and his home had returned to being a sanctuary. The subtle, strategic measures he had implemented had restored balance and peace. Life continued with its gentle rhythm, and he could finally enjoy the small moments of everyday living without the stress that had once overshadowed them. In the end, the story of the lawn, the persistent neighbor, and the man who sought to protect his privacy became a quiet example of thoughtful problem-solving. It was a story about human behavior, boundaries, and the power of strategic action. The man had navigated a challenging situation with patience, care, and intelligence, restoring his sense of peace and maintaining harmony in his community. The experience left him with a lasting understanding of how to handle conflict, assert boundaries, and preserve personal space without causing unnecessary disruption. With the situation finally calming down, the man could reflect on everything that had happened over the past weeks. His home, which had once felt invaded and tense, now felt like a true sanctuary again. The lawn, the flowers, and the quiet streets of the neighborhood were once more a source of enjoyment instead of stress. Every day he appreciated the peace he had regained and the thoughtful planning that had brought it back. The entire experience had taught him many lessons about patience, strategy, and understanding human behavior. He noticed that HOA Karen's presence had changed dramatically. She still appeared occasionally on the street, but her visits were brief and cautious. Her sense of authority had softened, and she no longer marched across his lawn with the same determination. Instead, she seemed to observe from a distance or engage with other neighbors without interfering with his property. The subtle shift in her behavior indicated that she had recognized the boundaries he had established. She had learned, perhaps unconsciously, that persistence must be tempered with respect for others' space. The man reflected on the importance of boundaries and how they affect relationships in a community. He realized that a simple desire to enforce rules or assert authority could create unnecessary conflict when it disregarded the personal space of others. By taking thoughtful action, he had been able to communicate his limits without confrontation. This approach not only protected his privacy, but also maintained harmony in the neighborhood. The subtlety of his measures allowed him to assert his position without creating a public spectacle or fueling resentment. Neighbors gradually began to notice the restored calm. Children played outside freely, neighbors walked their dogs without worry, and small conversations resumed along the sidewalks. The air that had once carried tension now felt light and ordinary again. People might have speculated about the earlier conflict, but it became